When Washington expected a counteroffer, it got a wall. That was the moment this stopped being a trade negotiation and started becoming something else. 5 demands had been laid out during the review of the agreement that underpins most of North America's economic system on paper. The playbook looked familiar: apply pressure, expose dependency, force movement, make Ottawa choose where it is willing to sacrifice protection in order to preserve access. But instead of choosing, Mark Carney effectively rejected all 5 that mattered for one reason above all. It did not look improvisational, it looked prepared. And that is the real story. Not that Canada said no, that Canada appears to have reached the point where it no longer believes North American trade can continue to be organized through fear. That is the axis of the entire confrontation. Not dairy first, not tariffs first. Fear first. For decades, the relationship carried a psychological order as much as an economic one. The United States was so large, so central, and so indispensable to Canadian exports that most serious disputes began with the same underlying assumption: Ottawa would eventually move because the cost of not moving was too high. This list tested whether that assumption still holds, and the answer this time appears to be no. That is what changes everything. Now, to understand why, you have to begin with the deepest issue rather than the loudest one. The United States imports about 3.8 million barrels of Canadian crude every day. That is around 23% of American refinery feedstock. More importantly, much of the Gulf Coast refining system is configured around Canadian heavy sour crude. This is not a rhetorical dependence. It is a physical one. It is embedded in industrial equipment, chemical processes, and long-built cost structures. Add New England's winter reliance on Canadian electricity, and the picture sharpens further. This is not a neighborly favor. It is part of the American operating system. That matters because once one side understands that the other side cannot easily rewire such a dependency, every threat begins to cast a shadow. The threat may still be real, but it is no longer total. And once total pressure becomes less believable, fear loses efficiency. That is the first break in the old hierarchy. Now move to dairy. The American position sounds simple. Canada's supply management system blocks access and punishes us producers with extremely high tariffs above quota. Abstractly, that sounds like obvious protectionism, but Canada does not experience it as an abstract tariff problem. It experiences it as a domestic stabilizer. Supply management protects politically important farming blocks, especially in Quebec, and shields a vulnerable agricultural sector from the full force of continental scale. That alone makes it hard to move. But the bigger issue is that Canada has now pushed the defense of the system beyond rhetoric and into law. That changes the category of the issue. A policy preference can be negotiated. A legislated protection system is much harder to reopen. Once a bargaining chip is turned into a structural constant, yielding it becomes expensive before talks even begin. That is why the American pressure sounded stronger than it actually was. Now go to digital media, where the dispute is even more revealing. Washington sees discrimination against American platforms. Ottawa sees cultural survival. That difference is the fight. If the issue were only money, compromise would still have more room. But if the issue is whether a country sitting next to the largest media machine in the world can preserve its own content pipeline, its own narrative economy, and some meaningful part of its own cultural market, then the dispute rises out of trade language into sovereignty language. Who gets the money? Who gets the audience? Who gets the algorithmic future? Who gets to decide whether Canada remains a distinct cultural space or becomes a downstream market inside an American attention empire? That is not a normal trade concession anymore. That is a state boundary being negotiated through regulation. And states are much harder to bargain out of those than Washington sometimes assumes. Then comes procurement here. The American case weakens almost instantly because it collides with the American system itself. Washington wants more access for us firms to provincial contracts, but the United States enforces domestic preference logic constantly through buy American rules, federal procurement structures, defense spending, and infrastructure policy. So for Canada to loosen domestic preference while Washington preserves its own would not feel like reciprocity. It would feel like one-way exposure. That is why Carney's refusal here was not dramatic. It was almost inevitable. Now look at alcohol. The issue sounds small, but it reveals the sequencing problem that runs through the entire package. Several Canadian provinces restricted American beer and wine after U.S. tariffs hit Canadian goods. That means the Canadian measures were retaliatory. They were not the opening move. So when Washington asks for those restrictions to be removed while its own tariffs remain in place, it is not offering a balanced negotiation. It is asking Canada to stop defending itself while the original pressure continues. That is not bargaining. That is submission language. And it explains why the answer came back so quickly. Now consider what was not pushed hardest: autos. That silence may be the loudest fact in the entire dispute, because the North American auto sector is one integrated organism. Parts cross the border multiple times before final assembly. Canadian factories make components for American vehicles. American plants supply engines and key systems into Canadian production lines. The sector works because the continent operates as one industrial machine. Washington knows that, and that is why autos stayed near the edge of the visible pressure package, not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important, pushed too hard there. And the United States injures its own manufacturers, its own labor constituencies, and one of the most valuable industrial networks on the continent. That tells you something essential. Each American demand was meant to expose Canadian dependence. Instead, each one exposed American constraint. Dairy collided with law. Digital media collided with sovereignty. Procurement collided with hypocrisy. Alcohol collided with sequence. Autos collided with integration. And all of it sat beneath energy, where dependence runs both ways. That is why the rejection mattered so much. It was not only a no, it was a no that carried structural confidence. And that confidence did not appear overnight. Canada had already started preparing. That is the hidden center of the story. For decades, roughly 75% of Canadian exports went to the United States. That concentration created the politics of caution. It taught every government that access came first and everything else followed from access. But that older model has started to loosen: more outward agricultural positioning toward China, more European options, domestic procurement, redirecting major capital toward Canadian suppliers, stronger federal, provincial coordination in strategic sectors, critical minerals reframed as future leverage in clean energy and AI competition rather than passive export flows. None of that replaces the U.S. market. That is not the point. The point is to reduce fear, to move from pure dependence to managed exposure. Once that happens, no becomes survivable. And once no becomes survivable, the whole relationship changes. That is why Carney's Davos line resonated so strongly. Countries not seated at the table end up on the menu. That was not just memorable rhetoric. It was a strategic translation. It reframed a trade review as part of a broader middle power problem. Whether states can build enough sovereignty before larger economies normalize coercion as the operating language of world order. That is a much bigger conflict than trade. Now look at Washington's contradiction. Trump talks publicly as if the agreement may not matter, but his own trade representative still invests enormous effort in laying out the conditions for preserving it. Greer points to roughly $960 billion in U.S. exports under the agreement and major growth since implementation. American industry groups from autos to energy to agriculture push for continuation. That does not look like a framework the United States can discard cleanly. It looks like a framework it cannot afford to lose without pain. And that is exactly why the pressure keeps revealing more than Washington wants it to reveal. The harder it pushes, the more clearly it shows where its own limits are. That is the inversion at the heart of the standoff. Pressure was meant to project dominance. Instead, it disclosed dependency. And once the weaker side sees that, the stronger side cannot escalate across multiple critical sectors without injuring itself. Fear begins to fail as an organizing principle. That is where North America may now be. Moving toward July with three visible paths: a full extension, a withdrawal, or annual reviews that stretch uncertainty all the way toward 2036. That third path will sound moderate. It is not. It is structural erosion. Capital-intensive sectors do not live on annual improvisation. If uncertainty becomes the normal state of North American trade governance, investment starts hedging away from the very integrated system the agreement was designed to protect, and this produces the deepest irony in the whole episode. If Washington keeps using pressure this way, it may accelerate exactly the diversification it says it wants to prevent. Every unresolved demand gives Ottawa more reason to widen alternatives. Every review cycle strengthens domestic arguments for hardening. Every failed pressure move teaches Canada that the next round should be met with even more preparation. That is the larger shift. This is not just a standoff over 5 demands. It is a struggle over whether North America remains organized around American course of gravity or begins drifting towards something looser, more hedged, and more sovereignty-driven. That is what changed, not simply that Canada rejected the list, that the list may have revealed more clearly than Washington intended, that fear no longer clears the table the way it once did.